Hi, everybody. I'm David Elzamendi, independent data architect and consultant at Level Up Your Data. And today we're going to be looking at the 10 essential steps, the first 10 steps that you have to execute when provisioning the Microsoft Fabric capacity. All right, let's get started. The first one that is usually overlooked is the landing zones. So the landing zones are essentially a scalable way of provisioning services in the Azure portal. And this is really important because this is going to allow you to not only adopt Microsoft Fabric, but also to be prepared to provision more services within the Azure environment. Many organizations overlooked this area, but essentially an Azure landing zone is a logical grouping of objects that are going to allow you to scale your organization and to follow the best practices recommended by Microsoft when it comes to the cloud adoption framework. So as you can see, there is a lot of documentation about the Azure landing zones in the Microsoft documentation. But essentially, if I can give you an example, you can download this diagram, and it's going to allow you to have a good baseline on structuring and provisioning services within Azure. And why is this important? Because when you provision the Microsoft Fabric capacity, you're going to provision it in the Azure portal. It's not going to be provisioned in Office 365. You will have to go to the Azure portal and provision the service in there. You can see here as well that we have an example of having different management groups that is logical containers of different subscriptions. And then within each subscriptions, basically, you're going to assign different capabilities. There is many ways of doing this. You have to find the right way for your organization. But essentially, a good example that I can show you in our own tenant is that we have grouped services and subscriptions in different management groups. And this gives you a different level of security and access, because you could be assigning access at the management group level, at the subscription level, or the resource group levels. Many ways of slicing and dicing this one, but it's usually overlooked when provisioning Azure services. And remember, Microsoft Fabric capacity, it is an Azure service. So go and have a chat with your sysadmins and come up with an initial design for your organization. It doesn't have to be as robust as the example that you get in the Microsoft documentation, but I usually recommend, look, go and download this Visio diagram from the Microsoft documentation, and this is a good starting point before you go and start provisioning Microsoft Fabric capacities and so on. Azure landing zones, that's the first one. The second one, and this is without even talking about Microsoft Fabric capacity, is definitely creating a Microsoft intra group. So you don't want to manage security of your Azure resources without using groups, essentially. And this happens as well. You can manage this through the Microsoft Intra admin portal. You can manage this through Office 365 admin portal, and you can manage this as well through Microsoft Intra in the Azure portal. So let's give you an example, right? We're going to create a group that we're going to use later. Naming convention aside, go and define a good naming convention for organization. Don't overthink it. It has to be meaningful. It has to be a name that is easy to understand what it's doing. And in this case, we're going to call this group Fabric. Let's call it developers, Power BI developers. You know what? Let's call it Fabric developers. There it is. Add a nice descriptions, developers who will create Microsoft Fabric resources. A good idea as well here is to assign an owner. I always recommend the owner could be the team leader of that specific team. It could be the manager, or in many cases, if you want to leave it empty because this is managed by service desk, that's fine. But I always like to rely that responsibility to the team leader or the manager. So those individuals will be the ones managing the membership of that specific group. And in members, essentially, you can assign as many members as you want. I won't assign any members or owners at this moment, but let's create this group and we're going to use it later. You'll see. So that was the second two things. And as you can see, we haven't even talked about Microsoft Fabric capacities. Now, before I continue, I wanted to highlight as well that I'm running a free conference. So if you go to microsoftfabric.global, we're running a free conference in April. It's totally free. We're going to have some amazing speakers from the industry with a lot of experience in the data analytics space, as well as in Microsoft. So don't forget to check out the microsoftfabric.global conference. Go and get your ticket. The registration is open. And as well, look, if you want to give a speech, there's a call for speakers open as well. All right. Now, next step. So we've done two steps essentially that they will help us have strong foundations within the Microsoft Fabric environment and our analytics platform. So the next one will be actually creating the Fabric capacity. So let's go and have a quick look at this. When you're creating the Fabric capacity, you can search for it in the Microsoft portal. Let's go and search for Microsoft Fabric. And you can see I have two. I would recommend having a strong naming convention for your whole Azure resources. So this is not only the services, but also the resource groups, the subscriptions. Have a look at that. If you don't have a naming convention, go and check out the Microsoft recommended naming convention for Azure services. It is available, it's free, it's a great starting point. But let's go and create our Fabric capacity. I'm going to copy this name because we're going to reuse it. Click create. And we're going to allocate this to one of our existing resource groups. And we're going to define a specific name. As you can see here, the subscription, the resource groups, logical containers. The subscription is a billable item. The resource group is a logical container for grouping the objects within that subscription. Then the capacity name, I always like either starting with FVC or Fabric capacity, or in many cases, you can just put a Fab. Something that is really easy for you to understand. In some cases as well, you might want to have different Fabric capacities covering different workloads. So this is where the name could give you some more room for highlighting what the service is doing, right? As an example, let's say that we create a Fabric capacity that is going to be focusing on doing the workloads for data movement. So this capacity, as an example, might be assigned only to moving data between services for the development environment. And in this case, we'll keep it simple. The region is where your data is going to be stored. This is really important, especially if you have any regulatory compliance. So this is where your data is going to be stored. Remember that. So that means that every time that you bring data within Microsoft Fabric, so this region plays an important role in your organization. In my case, I'm going to choose Australia East. That's where I'm based in Australia. And the size, as you can see, by default is F64. And here, independently of what capacity your organization needs, I would recommend, go and change the size to F2. Keep it simple, start small. You can always scale up and scale down, but start small and don't forget to assign a Fabric capacity administrator. We're going to come back to this in a sec. The next one is always creating some useful tags. This applies to all your Azure services. This allows you as well to, from a governance point of view, allow you to easily drill down different services and groups. So let's go and search cost center. We're going to select the environment, development, a few of them that I use. You can create your own as required, and then review and create. Right now, we're just provisioning the fabric capacity. So this means the place where we're going to store the information, as well as the compute power, the memory, the CPU that we're going to use. But once that this service is provisioned, we're not able to use it until we assign that to the workspaces, and we'll go to it. But before we leave the Azure portal for the last time, we want to do a few things. So the first one is to make sure that we assign capacity admins. So let's go and find our capacity that we created before. Choose here. You want to make sure that you assign multiple admins. The admins are going to be allowed to start and pause and control the capacity. Currently, we cannot assign a group in here. So that means that you will have to assign multiple users that can control this fabric capacity. Different team leaders, managers, assign as, not only 2 individuals, 4 or 5 individuals. If you want to assign a service account, you can do that as well. But my point is, don't be the only one who has access to manage this fabric capacity. Once that you have assigned different capacity administrators in here, there is one more step before we leave the Azure portal for the time being, which is you also have to give them access to the Azure service. And that means that by being a capacity administrator, they have admin control over the fabric capacity, but they cannot still see the Azure service. So my recommendation is to basically go to access control, navigate to add a new role assignment, and independently if you're using the PIM roles or not, what you want to do is to assign contributor access to the same members that you've given admin access to the capacity. So you select contributor, select the members that you want to give access to. So here is going to list a list of members. Let's see some test accounts. You assign a few of them. And click next. And review and assign, and that's done. Depending on the Microsoft Intra license that you will have the conditions section enabled or not. Okay, not in my case. Review and assign. So this means that now we haven't only assigned capacity admins, but those capacity admins as well, they are able to come to the Azure portal to see the service and to pause and start the fabric capacity from the Azure portal, essentially, without going that extra step of assigning the role in the Azure service. They won't be able to come here and pause and start the fabric capacity. On top of that, remember, so there was provision the fabric capacity. In many cases, we do recommend having a fabric capacity for development workloads and another one for production workloads, and then different fabric capacities for different workloads. Some capacities for moving data or some capacities for different departments. So we make sure that the workloads are distributed across different fabric capacities, and on top of that, critical workloads are not affected by development workloads, as an example. So that was our next tip. Now we're going to leave the Azure portal. We're going to leave this aside. We can't forget about this. And now we're going to finally navigate to app.powerbi.com. And again, because we finished in the Azure portal. Let's come over here. And if I navigate to my admin portal settings, you will see that under capacity settings, within the fabric capacity, we have one new fabric capacity. On top of that, you can see that 2 of them are grayed out, and this is because they are post. You can see the 2 of them, as we mentioned before. So if you want to manage this will take you to the Azure portal straight, where you will see that fabric capacity and you can start and resume it. There are many reasons why you might want to pause and start the fabric capacity. It could be a development environment, it could be a sandbox, it could be that your production environment doesn't have to be available 24/7, only during business hours or 12 hours during weekdays and so on. But the next step, once that you've done this, is that before we start using that fabric capacity, I would recommend, hey, go and make sure you start monitoring the performance of your fabric capacity. And that comes as part of provisioning the fabric monitoring app. And this is an out-of-the-box application that you can go and install for free. And it has been built and maintained by Microsoft. So if you go to the apps section, you can see that I already have one, but I should be able to provision another one. So navigate to the Fabric apps and click on Microsoft Fabric Capacity Metrics. Get it now. And now we're going to go to the workspace. In the initial configuration, when you open this app, when you install this app, it's going to ask for 2 different input parameters. I'm going to tell you what those input parameters are. The 2 input parameters, and let me see, we should be able to see it as well in the semantic model, hopefully. Let me see. So when you're installing the Fabric Capacity Metrics app for the first time, it's going to ask for the capacity ID, and it's going to ask as well for the offset of your time zones. This is going to help you for reporting. So those 2 parameters, there are a few ways of getting the capacity ID. The first one, as you saw before, you can navigate to the admin portal. Let's go and open the same window. That's fine. We'll go to capacity settings. And if you click on the fabric capacity name, and this is, I always have the same problem. I always go and click settings. So the other way around. Okay, so if you click settings, you get the capacity ID. So this is what you need. But many times I just come here and I click on the name. So when you click on the name, this is going to open some configuration parameters that we're going to see now. But here we don't see the capacity ID. But if we look at the URL, this ID as well will match as well the capacity ID that you see in the settings section. So if I click in here, you'll see that name matches this one here. So you need that capacity ID to configure in the Fabric monitoring app. Now, before we get any further, so now you have provisioned the Fabric Capacity Metrics app. This is going to allow you to monitor how you're using the resources of your Fabric capacity, This is super, super important. So when you build something, you build data movement orchestration, data transformations, you're doing performance testing, you want to understand how many capacity units, how many resources you need uh, to understand, do we need to scale up? Do we need to scale down? Do we need to increase our budget? How much is the service going to cost? So the Fabric Capacity Metrics app is the tool out of the box for you to understand how much performance you need, essentially. The only limitation that we have with the Fabric Capacity Metrics app is that it only keeps 14 days of data in here. It won't keep 1 month of data and so on. You can see as far as it goes, only 2 weeks. So there are workarounds. We built solutions that they help you have as much historical information of the resources that you're using. So if you want to know how to do that, please feel free to reach out, connect with me, and we'll guide you or we'll help you deploying that solution. But this is how you monitor the resources of your Fabric capacity. And remember, the Fabric capacity is essentially the compute power that you're going to need to run your workloads. And there are always two areas to it. So one thing is the compute power, and you can see that when provisioning the Fabric capacity in the Azure portal, we selected an F2. So this is the compute power that you're going to use for your transformations or moving data, for querying the reports, refreshing the semantic models, and so on. But on the other hand, there is an storage component that will be billed separately than the capacity unit. So those are the two main components that you will see in your invoice, or you have to take into account as part of your budgeting of Fabric usage: the storage and the capacity provisioned in the Azure portal. Now, the next step, once that we've done give access to the Azure portal, we're going to create and configure workspaces. So now we're getting to get to use the Fabric capacity. I always recommend two different workspaces that you have to create. So the first one is go and create a workspace for data movement objects. And always start with a development environment. Keep it simple. So this workspace is going to have any object related to moving data within Microsoft Fabric. And in the advanced sections, so we're going to assign the Fabric capacity that we created before. And you can see it doesn't show the other two Fabric capacities because they're post, so they're not available. And we're going to hit apply. So this is going to be the workspace where we have pipelines, data flows, notebooks that move data. And then we're going to create another workspace, which is going to be a workspace where we have our data stores. This is where you're going to have your lakehouses, your warehouses, and so on. We want to make sure that we're using the Fabric capacity. And in many cases, you also want to create another workspace that it could be actually where you have the reports that are going to be exposed to the business. I know. There are many ways of slicing and dicing this one. So go on. If you are using Power BI, follow the same approach that you were using with Power BI. This is just one way of isolating different workloads. And the same. So analytics dev, correct Fabric capacity, and hit create. So now what happens? So we created workspaces. You can see that at the top, we are using Fabric capacity in those workspaces. But what happens? I'm the only one with access to this workspace. So you really want to make sure that from the get-go, you assign the Fabric, the group that we created before. Admins, it's a great starting point for developers. Depending on what users are going to be doing, you will play with the different 4 roles. Fabric developers. So now I'm not the only one who has access to this. I can even go and remove myself if I was a member of this specific group. In this case, I haven't assigned myself as part of this group, but try to always assign access to groups and not to individuals. And we're going to do the same with the other 2 workspaces. Let's go. We'll quickly do that. Make sure I'm not the only one with access to these workspaces. I don't want to be just one point of failure where if things go wrong, everybody calls me. I don't want to be the only one fixing all the problems. So make sure that you give access to different individuals. Now, we've done that. Now, I'm going to go to my data movement workspace, and I want to show you. So now we created workspaces, but we also have to configure them. There is one thing, specifically one thing that I like to change in the workspaces where I'm going to be using notebooks. And what's that? So that is basically go to workspaces, navigate to the data engineering and data science section, go to Spark settings, and in here, so you can see this is the starter pool that you're going to be using as part of your notebooks. So what you want to do, let's close this, should have closed Teams before. What you want to do is essentially create a new pool, and we're going to call this one small pool. Because by default, in the starter pool, the node size, and this is the amount of memory and CPU, is medium. So I would recommend, look, when you're running your notebooks, use the less number of resources as possible. And if you need more resources, then you can customize a different starter pool. Let me step back, essentially. Let's go. When you execute notebooks in Microsoft Fabric, those notebooks, they run in an Apache Spark configuration. So that configuration will be essentially a cluster of nodes. So that's, imagine like computers, like workstations, VMs, running with CPU, a specific number of CPUs and memory, running your workloads. So what you want to do when getting started with Microsoft Fabric is start small, create a small pool, and this is going to be the starter pool of your notebooks. The next one is to make sure that you have this comes by default, but the high concurrency, so this across different notebooks that you're able to use the same configuration. So this is enabled by default. In many cases, you also want to enable the same for running pipelines. And then once that we finish, we go and click save. That's great. In regards to all the other options in here, one maybe that I recommend you to have a look will be workspace identity. This is something new. So if you are creating a data warehouse, you want that data warehouse owner to be the workspace identity in many cases and not the specific individual. So let's go and check that out. So if I navigate to the place where I'm going to have the data stores, and we create a lakehouse. Okay. You will see that the owner of this object is myself. So the problem that we have is that when my user is disabled or I leave the company, my colleagues are going to run into problems. The owner of the so let me go back so I can go to settings. So we really want to make sure that the owner of the lake houses, and you can see here, it is not an individual. And that's where workspace identities or even like a service account, they play a really important role. So now we have created the Fabric capacity, we have configured the access, we have assigned the Fabric capacity to the workspaces. We have as well the Fabric Metrics app. It's going to allow you to monitor resources and performance. So the next step, of course, is to go and configure Git. Because as you've seen before, we created the development workspaces. You can create the production workspaces and then provision the development environment. But I highly recommend, start with the development environment from the get-go and then connect this to Git. And then we start thinking about provisioning this to production. To configure Git for each one of the workspaces, I'll show you. So you go to workspace settings. And here you have a section for configuring Git. And in my case, I have an Azure DevOps account. But before I continue with this, I'm going to bring a different window. I'm going to go to the DevOps repository that I have. Let me see if I find it. Connect. Okay, open this in a new window. It's definitely no section. We'll come back to this. Just give a sec. I didn't click the right place. Say workspace settings, go to Git integration, Azure DevOps, connect. And here it will list the repositories that you have access to in this case. So in this case, you can see I don't have access to any of those two repositories. But let me quickly jump to a different tenant, and I can show you that. No problem. So let me see. Search. This happens with live demos, but we'll solve this in no problem. So we call this warehouse dev. Okay. So here I have a workspace. And what we want to do is to navigate to DevOps. This is a different tenant, but we're going to create a new repository. In many cases, you want a new project. It depends if you don't have a project in DevOps. This is, if you haven't started yet with Azure DevOps, highly suggest to use Fabric as an excuse to get started with DevOps. So we're going to create a new repository, and we're going to call this Fabric Warehouse. Create. And the same as within the Fabric access, you want to make sure that the group that you created before has access to a DevOps organization and also has access to the DevOps project. Once that you have created the repository, we'll be able to see it in workspace settings. If we navigate to Git integration, select the organization, select the project, and there'll be a Fabric warehouse here. And this way, now that we have connected the Fabric workspace within DevOps, any objects that we create here, let's go and create a warehouse. Okay. will be ready to go and be checked in within DevOps. So let's go and create a small table as well. So let's go and just create a new table. Okay. I wanted to run this script. So I made this bigger. Okay. And now we have a warehouse with the table. So if we go back to the workspace, you will see that there is a new change that can be committed within DevOps. So as soon as we hit commit, if we navigate to Azure DevOps, we're going to see that specific commit. Within there, we'll see our test table that we have created. So this is why it's important actually to connect your workspaces to Git, because it allows you to manage your solution, your code. If you have any problems, you can roll back this change. This is the perfect experience, fully integrated out of the box with Git, with Azure DevOps as well. So that was the next step. When creating I would suggest when getting started with the workspaces, go and create the data stores. So make sure that you have a place where you're going to land the data. This is before we move any information, before we essentially start applying transformations or bringing data within Microsoft Fabric. You really want to have the data stores. I would say, look, I know you're thinking, how can I know if I need a warehouse or a lakehouse? My recommendation is go and create a lakehouse and create a warehouse and start working with it. Start executing some test business cases with your team. So create the two of them. In some scenarios, and we're going to review this as part of one of our upcoming streams, but in some cases, you might need only the lakehouse. You might need a combination of the two of them. You might only need the warehouse. So I've done the three different combinations. I've done only lakehouse implementations. I've done only warehouses implementations, and I've done the combination of the two of them. So whatever it is, or whatever your organization needs, just go and give it a go. Go and try, execute a few business cases, understand the difference between the two of them. There is really good Microsoft documentation that explains the difference between warehouses, lakehouses, Fabric databases, real-time analytics. But until you get to go and test it, you will not know what your organization needs and what your team needs. So go and give it a go. That's my recommendation. And the last tip for today actually will be to make sure that you share the connections. You have to share the connections. This is not only Fabric. This is as well coming from the Power BI environment. So when you are bringing data from the on-premises systems or an API, so you have to create a connection. And we can see that as part of the settings. So we go to manage connections and gateways. You want to make sure that those connections are shared. And you can see in this case, all these different connections are only visible to me and owned by me. So not any other person in the organization can reuse the connections. And that defeats the purpose of establishing connections with source systems, but as well as to creating an enterprise data warehouse environment. So when you are creating a connection, just make sure you go back in here and you manage the users. go and select one that I can modify. Let me see. For some reason, those are personal mode. Let me try this one. Let me navigate to this one. In none of them, I don't seem to be able to change the connections in there. So let me navigate in here, and we'll have a look what the case is. So sharing connections. So manage users. And in here, we cannot see it, but essentially we want to give connections access to other users. So let me click in here. Cannot show it to you right now, but essentially in this section, manage users, you want to assign more users to be able to manage those connections. We don't want to be the only point of failure. Let's try one more time. So if I go to settings, no. Let's try with this one. Delete this. I don't know why it doesn't allow me to change the other ones, but when you're managing connections, go to manage users, and in here, you want to add essentially the same group that we created before. This one, I'm going to just add any group, and make sure that the group, essentially, you want to go and allow them to create connections, but also to manage, to be the admin of the gateway in this case. So the same that we've done with the gateway applies to the connections. And that was the last tip for today. So look, this is all the 10 things that we've seen today is without even having to build pipelines or starting to move data. So these are 10 steps that they're going to allow you to set up good foundations for your environment. So I highly recommend going and having a look at sharing the connections, creating the Active Directory groups, the Microsoft Intra groups, the policies, and so on. And I'm going to leave you as well with, before we finish this step, the last tip as well that I really like this. So when you're setting up the Fabric capacity, people ask me, how do we know if we use all the resources? So recently, Microsoft has added within the Fabric capacity options. So if we go to capacity settings, we have a few more options within our Fabric capacity. So if we click on it and we go to not search protection, not so much, but we want to go to notifications. And in here, you want to enable all these options. So when we have used 70% of our Fabric capacity, when we're having slowdowns, we want to contact the capacity admins, and maybe as well if you have any service desk account and so on. This is going to allow you to notify people if you're running either out of capacity or if you're having performance issues. And with this last tip, I like to say, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out into my social networks, connect in LinkedIn, and don't forget, go to microsoftfabric.global. We are running a free event about Microsoft Fabric in April, so go and get your free ticket, and looking forward to seeing you at the next step.